Hey everybody. In this lecture we're going to continue our discussion of what I term the education of Benjamin Franklin. As we learned from the last video, Franklin only had 3 years of formal education. So when I say the education of Benjamin Franklin, I mean that in a broader sense. We're learning about his childhood and his teenage years. Ben learned a lot of things in life other than just what he learned in classrooms, okay? As we all do. And so in the last video, we talked about his early formal education, his apprenticeship to his brother James. We'll continue to talk about that. And also about the vegetable diet and what I take away as an important faith in reason that stems from his decision to become a vegetarian. Today, for this lecture, what we're going to start with in our continuation of our previous lecture is the idea of equality and how the idea of equality gets reflected in the writing of the autobiography. I've already introduced this idea, but I want to develop it more right here. I told you, at no point in the autobiography does Benjamin Franklin make some big pronouncement about the importance of equality. And in no way does he tie this with other elements of Enlightenment thought. He's writing about his life. But I also told you, as we went over Franklin's justifications for writing the autobiography, and when we went over those first few paragraphs in great detail, one of the explanations he gives for why he's writing the autobiography is to hold himself up as an example to other people. He acknowledges, I'm rich, I'm famous, I've been happy most of my life. Maybe some of you want to pay attention to this. Maybe some of you want to try some of the things I've done, because things have certainly worked out pretty well for me. And so Franklin held himself up as a blueprint to be copied. Okay. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide. Yeah. But one of the amazing things about the autobiography is Benjamin Franklin's willingness to allow us, the reader, to see ourselves as being like Ben. Franklin was extraordinary in so many ways. But one of the things he does in the autobiography is actually try to blunt, to downplay some of his extraordinary nature. There are all kinds of impressive things about Benjamin Franklin's life he doesn't talk about. The most vivid example of this, he doesn't talk about the American Revolution or his participation in the American Revolution at all in the book. Okay. Obviously, he couldn't talk about it in part 1 because the American Revolution hasn't happened yet. But parts 2, 3, and 4 all happen after the American Revolution, and Franklin doesn't say anything about it at all. The closest he gets is acknowledging, then there was this trouble with England, and then it blew over, and now things are better. I mean, that's as close as he gets, which is really interesting. Why doesn't he talk about the revolution? I don't know about you, but if I was a successful revolutionary that helped create a novel kind of government, unlike anything in human history to that point, and I sat down to write my autobiography, I would find some space to write about that. I would put it in my autobiography. Call me crazy. But Ben doesn't, which begs the question, why? Well, I think it gets back to the purpose of writing his memoir, his autobiography. He really wants it to be something that would be useful to later generations of his family and to other readers like you and me. He wants to hold himself up as a blueprint to be copied. But I think some of his fear would be if he started to write about some of the more extraordinary aspects of himself and his life's experience, he would lose us as a reader. What Ben wants to talk about in the autobiography is hard work and discipline and trying to make good decisions, because he thinks we can all do that. We can all work harder. We can all try to make better decisions. All right? We can all do that. But if he starts talking about these extraordinary opportunities, like being a revolutionary, he's going to lose most of us. If suddenly in the autobiography he starts talking about, well, then George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and I sat down to... Suddenly he's moved his experience to a realm that most of us practically aren't going to get to replicate. Chances are most of us aren't going to get the opportunity to be revolutionaries, at least not successful revolutionaries. This is why Franklin doesn't talk about the American Revolution. That's not what this book is about. That's not what he wanted to talk about for his grandchildren and great-grandchildren to learn. He wants to keep it on our level, to talk about things that will be practical for us. Not all of his life, not all these remarkable things about himself, but rather write his life story in a way that allows us to see ourselves in him. Throughout the book we can read and think to ourselves, wow, Ben did that. I can do that too. And that's what he wants us to be able to do as a reader. Okay, we can't do everything. Ben still reveals some extraordinary things about his life. But in general, he's kind of minimizing his extraordinary nature to make it seem like, hey man, I did it, you can do it too. Work harder. Save more money. Don't waste your money on stupid things. Accumulate your money. Invest it in things. Make good decisions. Stay away from bad decisions. By the way, Ben talks about his bad decisions. We'll talk about some of them here, right? But he highlights them as bad decisions and uses them as negative examples, like, don't do this. I made this mistake. You shouldn't do that thing, right? And so I told you earlier that at no point does Franklin claim or make some big pronouncement about the importance of equality in life. However, it's embedded into the spirit that the book was written, at least for white men, at least for people that he saw that were like him. He's saying, I did this, you can do it too. Okay? You can replicate the things I did in this book. He's telling every reader, at least those that he imagines like himself, a white man, I don't think I'm much better than you. I don't think I'm much different than you. I don't think what I did was all that terribly extraordinary. I think a lot of people, if they worked hard, saved money, were disciplined, were focused, tried to make good decisions, I think a lot of people could have ended up where I ended up. I'm not that different from you. All right? So throughout the book, there is a commitment to equality, not expressed explicitly, but implied on almost every page. You could do this thing too. So if reason that we talked about in the last lecture is one of the most obvious elements of the Enlightenment exposed in the autobiography, equality is probably one of the most abstract. Okay, but it's there. It's there if you step back and just think of what the entire project was. This is why he doesn't talk about the revolution. He wants us to imagine we could do the same sort of things. And if he just starts talking about fancy stuff like being a revolutionary, then we lose him. Then we can't be like him. And he wants to keep us on it on our level. That's why he doesn't talk about the revolution. Okay. Let's move on to another thing. Again, this gets back to, like I told you when we talked about the vegetable diet, Ben gets a lot of ideas from books as he's reading. And similar thing happened with this idea of deism. Okay. So Franklin grew up in a Presbyterian family. Presbyterianism is a Protestant religious faith. The Presbyterians were one of these Christian groups that broke away from the Catholic Church. The Presbyterians had a lot of similarities to the Puritans. Okay, Presbyterianism came primarily from Scotland, so it's a Scottish version of a Protestant tradition. And Presbyterianism and Puritanism were so similar, we don't even need to get into much detail about differences. For example, the biggest similarity they had, beyond just the broader structure of Christianity, is both the Puritans and the Presbyterians believed in predestination. Okay, they were on board. They were both on board with that. The bottom line is that the Franklin family that were Presbyterians were from Puritan Boston, and they really suffered no negative effects of being Presbyterians. They were largely accepted by the Puritans of Boston. The people of Boston thought that Presbyterian was close enough to Puritanism that it wasn't an issue. Okay. And so that's what Franklin grew up. He grew up a Presbyterian. Okay. When his father sent him to grammar school when he was 8 years old, like we talked about last time, his father was assuming Ben would grow up to be a Presbyterian minister. But in his middle teens, right around that same time that Ben becomes a vegetarian, he reads a book that was actually denouncing this relatively new religious philosophy of deism. Okay. Deism is a religious, it's hard to describe it as a religion per se because it didn't really require religious practice. So some people term it as a religion. It's more a sort of religious outlook than an actual practiced religion. And we very much associate deism with the Enlightenment. Okay. Let's talk about what the belief was. Deism was the belief that there is a God. Okay. It wasn't atheism. It wasn't even agnosticism. There was a belief that there is a God. And this God was a creator God. He created the universe, he created the world, he created man. But at some point after creation, this God no longer took an active involvement in the universe, in the world, in the lives of men. That this God was simply a creator God that created the universe as almost you could think of as a self-sustaining machine that would operate on its own. And after this creation, God was no longer actively involved in the operation of the world. So you didn't need to pray. God wasn't starting wars. God wasn't ending wars. He wasn't making people sick, so there was no reason to pray to God for cures to illness. He was no longer involved in that. All those things were happening, but he was no longer involved. He just created the universe. It operates on his own, and he's gone. What's he doing? Who knows? Maybe creating other universes. This became an increasingly popular outlook for intellectuals during the 1600s and the 1700s into the 1800s. It was never a broadly popular religious outlook. There were never a lot of deists, but among intellectuals, there was a growing belief in it. And it has to do with some of the things we've already talked about. The real motivation for deism was to try and create a rational concept, or at least what these people believed was a rational concept of God. Right? At this time, there still seemed to be the need for the idea of God as a creator God. For example, this is before ideas of maybe the Big Bang theory, or Darwinian evolutionary biology, which might allow for an explanation of how life formed without the idea of a God. This is all before that. Right? And so the idea of a creator God made sense. Some power that created the universe. All this stuff had to get explained somehow. Where did it come from? Okay, it seems rational there might be a power that created that. But then everything that happens afterwards, some of these people that were really emphasizing reason had a hard time explaining the traditional Christian God's actions. Why would a loving God allow for warfare, for disease, for famine, for strife, for hate? Why would a rational God do that? By the way, I'm not questioning this. I'm not telling you to question this. I'm just saying this is what some of these Enlightenment figures were wondering. How is that rational? They could place themselves in the idea of God. If I was an all-powerful God, I wouldn't create a world filled with all these problems. It doesn't make any sense. Well, if you conceive of a creator God that after creation allows the universe to operate on its own, the world, humanity to operate on its own, let it go where it's going to go. To some of these people, that made more rational sense. A creator God that's no longer actively involved in this world sort of makes sense. Okay, that's where war comes from. That's where disease comes from. You know, the system was created. There were maybe some imperfections and some flaws. And there's no longer a God that's allowing it to happen. He exists. She exists. It exists. But it's not actively making this happen. Okay, that's what deism was. This idea, there's a creator God, created the universe, it operates on its own, and now God is no longer involved. Sometimes deists would talk about God as the great clockmaker. They used a metaphor of the clockmaker. What does the clockmaker do? In the 18th century, a clock was a highly complicated piece of engineering. Right? The clockmaker creates that clock, winds it up, and then lets it go. After the clockmaker's built the clock, what does he do? Does he stare at the clock and watch every second tick off? No. The watchmaker goes on and does other things. He goes home, eats dinner, goes to sleep, starts working on another clock. That's the way deists thought God operated. Right? He built a clock. He built this complicated, not literally, he built this complicated machinery of the universe, like a clockmaker makes a complicated mechanism. He winds it, God wound it up, and now it's going on its own. That's what deism was. So I said it wasn't really a religion because it didn't require you to go and pray and worship and go to church. You didn't have to do any of those things. It was more a religious outlook. So that's what deism was. And so Ben was actually reading a book denouncing deism. It was a Christian talking about how terrible deism was and all the reasons why it was wrong. But the more Ben was reading it, Ben was sort of scratching his head going, I don't know, man, I kind of like this idea of deism. I'm kind of down with it. And then Ben decides to become a deist. he becomes, as he tells us, a thoroughgoing deist. Okay. And not only did Ben become a deist, but he starts to convince some of his friends, eventually just going out on the streets in Boston, trying to talk to people about deism, to convince them to become deists. As we'll talk about later, this is going to cause some problems in Ben's life. All right. But after a couple years of being, as he terms himself, a thoroughgoing deist and convincing some of his friends to become a deist, he noticed something. And I quote it down here on this slide eventually. Oh, wait, I'll hold off before I read that quote. What he noticed, and the problem was, is that without any sort of built-in morality, deism doesn't have any built-in morality. And without the idea of a judgmental God watching you, Ben said he became a worse person. Without the idea of God watching, he became a worse person. Even more so, he tells us, his friends really went off the rails. You almost get the impression that Ben kind of seems to think that he could probably handle a deist. He admits he became a little worse. But what really troubled him was seeing the effects on some of his friends. Some of his friends really went off the deep end and became way worse. Those people without the sense of God watching them just started to go wild. And that's what made Ben start to question deism. Maybe it wasn't a good idea. On page 43, I quote here for what he says is, he's starting to question this. He said, quote, "I began to suspect that this doctrine of deism, though it might be true, was not useful." That's an interesting way to talk about it. He still admits maybe deism is correct. Maybe that is really how God operates. Maybe he was just a creator God, created the universe, and it runs on its own. Maybe that's true. Truthfulness is not why he abandoned deism. But it's not useful. That's a really interesting way to think about why you join a particular religion or not. We usually don't talk about that, right? Usefulness. You know, like, I used to be a Catholic, but I stopped being a Catholic because being a Protestant was more useful? It's weird. I used to be a Christian, but I really like football. And you're supposed to be in church on Sundays for football, but football games are on Sunday. So I converted to Judaism because the Sabbath in Judaism is, sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night. That's the Sabbath for Jews. And there's no professional football on then, so I converted. Like, that would be really weird if you said that's why you changed gods, right? But that's kind of what Ben's saying here. He's saying deism might be true, but it wasn't useful. Why was it not useful? Because people in this world, his friends that he converted to deism, he himself, he says, became worse. That's why it's not useful. And so after a couple years, Ben tells us he stops being a deist anymore and comes up with a new idea about religion. All right? And his new idea about religion was heavily based on the idea of morality and the connection between morality and religious faith. So he tells us in the next quote I have here down in this slide, from page 62. I never doubted, for instance, the existence of the deity, God. That the most acceptable service of God was the doing good to man. So Ben says, look, my life, I never questioned if there was a God. There was a God. Ben wasn't an atheist. Okay, but he was a deist for a while, but the problem with deism was is that there was no built-in morality. There was nothing to tell you to do the right thing and avoid the wrong thing. And this was the fundamental problem with deism. This is why deism was not useful. So Ben comes around to this idea that what should be really important in religion is morality. And this becomes his basis for judging religious belief. If a religion makes you more moral, if it makes you in this world want to do good things and avoid bad things, he would like that religious faith. But if that religious faith somehow encouraged you to neglect issues of morality or encouraged you to do bad things, he did not like that religious faith. Okay? Morality would become the basis for judging religion. Okay? That's what was really important for Ben. Okay? Remember I told you before that Ben wasn't terribly interested in ideas of how you get into heaven and how you stay out of hell. Notice that's not really the factor in any of this decision making. What does Ben seem to like about religion? Its effect on you in this world. Does this religion you believe in make you a better person in this world? If it does, he likes it, and he's cool with it, and he's cool with you believing in it. All right? Questions about does this particular religion get you into heaven or keep you out of hell? He doesn't seem to be terribly concerned about that. You can almost think of Franklin's attitude towards religion almost like social control. Does this religion help control you in this world better, make you better behaved? If it does, Ben's cool with it. He likes that religion. If this religion seems to make you worse, kind of like what he observed with deism, he's not okay with it, and that should be abandoned. And this is going to bring us back to some ideas about secularism and how secularism works in Benjamin Franklin's ideas, his thinking, his life. The good thing about looking at religions in terms of moral terms for Benjamin Franklin was that he believed if you boil down most religions, you get a very similar moral teaching. Don't kill. Don't steal. Don't lie. Don't rape. The major religions of the world aren't a lot of agreement on these issues. Don't do those things. Avoid those things. So he talks about this again, the next quote. It's a continuation from page 62, where he has this. Quote, "These I esteemed the essentials of every religion, morality. And being to be found in all the religions we had in our country, I respected them all." Now, what Ben's really talking about here is different interpretations of Christianity. He's saying, by the 1700s, in colonial North America, there were a lot of different types of Christians coming over and living in North America now. Lots of different interpretations. And what Ben said was, despite all their theological differences, despite all of these different interpretations of Christianity that might say you have to do this to get into heaven, you might have to do that to avoid going to hell, Ben says, when you boil them all down, you basically get the same morality. Don't kill, don't steal, don't lie, don't rape, don't steal. You get basically the same thing. And so Ben says, I was cool with all of them. Insofar as all of these different interpretations encourage you to be a better person, I was okay with that. Later on, when Ben moves to Philadelphia and becomes wealthier, he tells us he would contribute to any new church being built in Philadelphia, believing that it would often encourage people to be more moral. Would he go and attend those churches? He most certainly would not, because he didn't think he needed that. It was good for other people, but he didn't necessarily think he needed that. When he got to Philadelphia, Franklin must have encountered the Presbyterian church there and the Presbyterian minister, and Ben must have mentioned to the Presbyterian minister, like, oh, I grew up Presbyterian. And Ben tells us that the Presbyterian minister would sometimes put pressure on Ben to go to church and attend. Benjamin Franklin, you backsliding heathen. I expect to see you in church on Sunday. All right, I want you there. And Ben would, every once in a while, Ben would say, oh, okay, all right, I'll go to church. But he was always disappointed, he tells us. Ben tells us what he wanted from religious instruction, what he wanted from a church service, was encouragement to be a better person. Actually, the exact thing he says is to be a better citizen. But then he would go, and all the Presbyterian minister would talk about is how to be a better Presbyterian, how to follow the specific theology of the Presbyterians, which wasn't necessarily about morality. And Ben said he would always leave disappointed, and that's why he wouldn't go back. For example, one of the things that was particularly emphasized back in those days, you don't hear as much about it these days, but was a big deal back then, was keeping the Sabbath holy. And what that means for Christians is not working on Sunday. That's the day of the Lord. That's the day that the Lord rested. That's the day we should rest, in particular, so you can go to church. But you're not supposed to work. And back in the old days, they took that seriously. Don't work on Sunday. That's a sin. For Ben Franklin, that never made any sense. He loved to work. Ben was always working. And what's the problem with working? Ben wondered. Like, I work any other day of the week. People honor me. People tell me how great I am. And then I work on Sunday and suddenly I'm a bad guy? Why? There's no moral reason not to work on Sunday. All right? If I work on Sunday, I'm not hurting another human being. I'm not stealing from them. I'm not killing them. I'm not lying to them. There's no moral reason not to work on Sunday as opposed to working on any other day. But there is a theological reason for Christians, which is in the Bible. It talks about not working on Sundays. Ben didn't care about that. Ben ignored that. That wasn't about morality to Ben. So when the Presbyterian minister says, keep the Sabbath holy, Ben's kind of rolling his eyes going, why? I'm not interested in that. I'm interested, give me some advice, minister, how to be a better person. To not steal, how to not lie. I want advice on that. But instead the Presbyterian minister is telling him about things like keeping the Sabbath holy. Ben wasn't interested in that. Ben was interested in this world here. Not how to get into heaven, not how to avoid hell. We'll talk a little bit later about sort of why that might have been. All right. The intriguing idea about all this is that to have a secular point of view, as we've talked about, secularism allows people to believe what they want to believe religiously, but argues against the use of state power to mandate people to believe or not believe in certain things. A secular society lets you believe in your religion, but prevents you from forcing other people to believe your religion through the use of law. I talked about this before. You can talk to your neighbor about converting to your religion. You just can't create a law that forces your neighbor to believe your religion. Okay? A secular society allows different people to believe what they want when it comes to religion. And therefore, the hope of a secular society is that people of different faiths can live together without killing each other. But fundamental to that belief is a faith we see here with Benjamin Franklin, which is Franklin is saying here that when you boil down religious faith, with different religions, you often get the same morality. My religion says to not kill. My neighbor's religion says not to kill. My religion says to not steal. His religion says to not steal. Mine says not to lie. His says not to lie. All right? If that's true, if in fact you can boil down most religion and get a similar morality, then why can't we live together? We share a basic fundamental morality that allows us to live together in a society. Now, we can differ on what you have to do to get into heaven. We can differ on how you avoid hell. We can differ on what deity we worship. But if our basic morality is the same in this sort of Franklinian sense, then we can live together with different religious faiths. We can maintain a secular society that allows for religious freedom, while at the same time allows people of different faiths to coexist with one another. I don't need my neighbor to believe in the same God as me to still be a good neighbor. You know, I've talked to him about it before. I told him I'm worried he's going to go to hell. And I've tried to tell him, you know, he should follow my God. But he's still resistant, and not only is he resistant, he keeps trying to convert me to his God, which is a bit annoying. But you know what? He's a good neighbor. You know, doesn't play music late at night, mows his lawn and makes his house look real nice. When I run out of coffee, I can go over and borrow some from him. Every once in a while we have block parties, and he's a good cook and makes really great barbecue. He's a great guy. Too bad he's going to be in hell for the rest of eternity, but that doesn't make him a bad neighbor. This Franklinian emphasis on judging religions based on their moral teachings, not their ideas about how to get into heaven or avoid hell, but rather, do they encourage you not to kill, not to lie, not to cheat, not to steal? If they do, we can live together. Okay. All right. A lot of stuff in this PowerPoint. So I'm going to stop here again, and we'll pick up. The next thing we're going to talk about is science. But I hope these ideas of how Franklin is showing an emphasis and a faith in equality and secularism is coming through in this lecture here. I'll see you guys next time.